Good evening to you all. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. And in particular, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome my friend, Danny Quah. Danny is Professor of Economics and Kuwait Professor at the London School of Economics and also visiting Professor at the National University of Singapore. He served previously as a council member on Malaysia's National Economic Advisory Council, and he's been a consultant to the Bank of England, the World Bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, among other illustrious economic institutions. Danny is published in just about every major economics journal you can imagine. He's therefore an ideal ref submission. But of course, he's much more than that, and he's particularly well known for his work on the shifting global economy, mapping the eastwards movement in the world economic center of gravity away from the 1980s mid-Atlantic location. He's also a Taekwondo champion. You may not know that, but I first discovered that at the London School of Economics in the senior common room when I was watching Danny looking at his phone. And I said, what are you watching? Thinking he was watching some, karate movie during his lunch break. But actually he was looking at a performance of himself cutting through with his mighty blow a large brick of wood, correct? Correct. And when I call him a Taekwondo champion, you really need to know he is a Taekwondo champion. So it is a great pleasure to welcome this Renaissance friend of mine here. He's going to speak to the title there in front of you, so I don't need to repeat it. And please join with me in giving him a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you, David, for your much more positive introduction of me than I really deserve. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here, not least in that this is David's lecture series. He invited me, and I considered David one of my intellectual mentors. Until a time when I met David and got to know him and had conversations with him, I was an economist who, as David says, has published in different journals, but I was a technical economist, and most of my work was relatively technical in that direction. And it was really through David's intellectual challenging me that I started to broaden out and ask what I hope are now more interesting questions, questions like the ones surrounding the topic I want to talk about this evening. As David has said, this evening I want to talk about managing the world, but really that's what it is about how shifts in the global economy are introducing fractures and tensions that all of us know about to some degree, that experts like David have been writing about and thinking about solutions to, and that I feel my own small side to this is to try and be clearer about where these tensions emerge. What are the parameters of that tension? What are the contours of how global governance needs to adjust to the new reality out there? And as an economist, I approached this topic from the perspective of an economist, first and foremost. But I went very quickly, after talking about the economic facts, the economic pressures, to wander into territory that's unfamiliar to me, but would be familiar to my host and to several of you in the audience who are much more expert in this field and that I'm trying to learn from. When I say talk about managing the world, or I think about the shifts in the global economy, what exactly should we envision? Well, I think we should be thinking about things like this. This is the world, this is the global economy that we are trying to understand, whose fractures, whose tensions, where the pressures derive from, that we then think about problems of global governance and international relations. When I say this is the world, Well, obviously, what this is a satellite photograph of our planet taken at night. In what sense is this something that's of interest to you and me as social scientists, people who are interested in global governance? Well, what this photograph shows, it's a false image in the first instance. Those who are more technical among us will quickly reflect on how this is a picture of the world taken at night. Night does not fall on the world all at the same instant. Every time half the world is night, the other half is in daytime. This is a false image of the Earth that shows lights in the nighttime sky. And the reason that it's interesting to look at lights in the nighttime sky is that that tells us where people live. It tells us where people play at night. It tells us where people go clubbing, where people go out to evening lectures, they go out to restaurants. And where people live and play is also where they work. Where they work is where they create wealth and add value. The global economy is this picture. And this picture shows a severe concentration of economic activity along the transatlantic axis. If you imagine a line running down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean from North Pole to South Pole, on the eastern side of that line, you see the bright lights that are the United Kingdom and Western Europe. And on the western side, you see the bright lights that are North America. You see the east coast of the United States. You see New York City, you see Boston, you see Washington, D.C. And as you move west, further and further west in that picture, you see the bright lights that are Silicon Valley. You see the wealth that's been created at Google and Microsoft on the west coast of the United States. Concentration of lights in this picture is the global economy. And this picture shows the global economy concentrated along the transatlantic axis. Sure, there are pieces of lights elsewhere. With apologies to those friends of mine from Australia, however, Australia is mostly dark in this picture. Not very much economic activity. Not much more than you see of the continent of Africa, really. At the global scale, economic activity, as illustrated in this map, is the transatlantic economy. 50% in Western Europe, 50% in North America. And we'll let Japan have a little bit of playtime in the nighttime sky. We'll let the east coast of China have a little bit of airplay. But mostly it's a transatlantic economy. So when someone stands up before you and says the global economy is changing, there are new tensions because Davos has now organized the new Davos of world champions in Tianjin in northeast China. You look at this picture and you say, well, actually, you know what? The global economy is pretty much the global economy that my grandparents knew. It is concentrated along the transatlantic axis. Well, here's the thing. This picture is the global economy as our grandparents knew it, because this picture was taken decades ago. The world has indeed shifted, and the world economy no longer looks like this picture. One problem is that NASA no longer takes satellite photographs of Earth the way that it did when this picture was composited, that you can pick up off of NASA's terabytes of data. So what we have to do is to replace this picture with a modern counterpart. Where is the location of economic activity that we can use to focus on how changes in global governance are needed? Well, here is the modern version of this picture. This is a picture that teases away from the fine detail that the previous map of the world showed us. What it does instead is it tries to construct the center of world's economic activity. In other words, if we had gone back and looked at the world in this way, we would have looked at this picture and our eye would be drawn to somewhere on the transatlantic axis, because 50% of where the world adds value, creates wealth, is in North America. The other 50% mostly in Western Europe and pieces elsewhere. Our eye would be drawn to a point on the transatlantic axis that begins this picture, but then this picture animates what's actually happened in the world. if we recreated, if we went back and tried to locate, figure out where economic value is being created on all different points on the earth, and we carried that picture forwards, and we let our eye drift towards where the center of economic activity is, what our eye would show is this animation. It is an animation that begins in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles west of London, hundreds of miles off the west coast of Africa. But then this picture shows a snapshot of the global economy every 3 years following that. And what we notice is that every 3 years following that 1980 snapshot, the world economy has steadily drifted eastwards. What's driving the global economy in this picture and in reality is the rise of the East. And if I stop this picture, and indicate through a sequence of black dots where the center of the world economy was every 3 years following 1980, following where you and I located it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, what we would realize is that as of last year, the center of the world economy had moved 5,000 kilometers east of its 1980s mid-Atlantic moorings. So that by last year, it was located, the center of the world economy was located in the Arabian Peninsula. It had moved from west of London to east of London, across the entire length of the Mediterranean Ocean, to east of Helsinki and Bucharest, east of Izmir, Turkey, to now somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula. And if that momentum continues from the fluctuations of economic activity, the rise of lights in the nighttime sky over Australia, the rise of China, the rise of India, then the sequence of dots indicating the center of the world economy will steadily drift eastwards. It does not shoot off the Asian continental landmass. It begins to slow down and cluster. And where it clusters is on the Indian-China border. That's where the world is headed. The thesis that I want to build, for which the rest of the talk will then try and engage, is that what we're seeing in the world is a fracturing of two large landscapes. A landscape in global economic activity, as measured and indicated by this picture, where the center of the world has already moved 5,000 kilometers east from where it used to be, and in the next 20 years will move another 5,000 kilometers towards the India-China boundary, while at the same time, most of the world views global policy making, views the center of global governance, view the center of the world political landscape still to be firmly transatlantic. What we see is a dramatic fracturing of economic and political landscapes, where the traditional centers of political power will no longer be the ones that hold economic power. Okay. Now, on the one hand, this is simply a rehashing of ideas that are floating out there. What I want to do as an economist, as a technical economist, is to firm up some of these ideas by putting precise quantifications on them. And at the same time we do this, try and go through a list of arguments that people, social scientists, scholars make about how global governance needs to shift and needs to adjust. Okay. So a different way of looking at that picture is this. Okay. Now what I would like to argue is that this shift in the global economy that I've just described to you through this simple animation, through a center of world economy, it is one facet of things that are going on more generally. And the thesis, the first part of the thesis I want to build is that this movement of economic power east is occurring on many different dimensions. It is not merely the creation of economic value. It's a profound change in the distribution of the welfare across the 7 billion people that comprise humanity. It is a profound change in the way global business cycles operate. It is a profound change in the way technologies will manifest in the world over the next couple of decades. So I need to convince you that these changes are going on. After I've done that, I want to convince you that there are objections to the thesis that these changes are profound and permanent. There are people, there are scholars, there are social scientists who say these changes that are occurring are superficial, because very quickly the world will come back to where the world's economic and political landscapes will once again align and be consistent with each other on the transatlantic axis. The world will still firmly be American, North American, with Western Europe playing a side role. I want to argue their position, and then I want to show you a set of facts that suggest that those people need to moderate their position, that this eastward shift is more profound and more real than one might think. I'm not going to suggest that this eastward shift will be smooth. I will try and point to problems along the way, but I want to point to how there's a large problem in the world, and that large problem is our collective inability to come to terms with this fracturing of the world's political and economic landscapes. Okay, so here's how do I want to build this? Well, a further fact that I want to confirm for us is that this eastward shift of the world, which is being brought about by the rise of China and India, is occurring not just through where economic value, the location of where economic value is generated, because after all, that might be happening because the elites in China and India are benefiting from exposure to globalization, and that really there is no broad-based movement in this eastward shift of economic activity. So first fact, this eastward shift of economic activity is the most powerful force we have in the world today for lifting people out of poverty. The rise of the East, the rise of China and India have done more than anything else, more than all the aid programs put together, more than all the initiatives that the Western world has done to try and help people out of poverty. This rise of the East has accounted for more than 100% of the reduction of world poverty. Now, the World Bank numbers that I flag up here, I won't rehearse, but I simply want to point out to you that if we go out and measure the number of people living in poverty between 1981 and 2005, and I look down at the number of people living in China that experienced that extreme poverty. In 1981, 835 million people lived in China lived in that situation. By 2005, 208. China lifted 627 million people out of poverty in this time. And if you look at what happened in the world, well, the world's extremely poor. There were just under 2 billion people living in extreme poverty in 1981. By 2005, there was just under 1.5 billion people. The world did lift 500 million people out of poverty, but there was about 100 million people fewer than China did. More than 100% of the reduction of world poverty was due to just China alone. If you look at what happened in the global financial crisis, following the 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers, 42% of the world's growth since 2008 is accounted for basically by China and East Asia. China alone grew 3 times, added to world economic growth 3 times what the United States did following the 2008 global financial crisis. When you look at what's happening here, and you think about what these changes are like in the world, well, it is useful to reflect, to take a step back and reflect on what development economists and social scientists who are interested in development might be moved to pronounce on this particular change in the world. On the one hand, they might say, well, all we're seeing is economic development happening around the world, and what we're seeing is the rise of the East being driven by economic development. But those who work in economic development know how hard it is to bring about growth and development even in small countries. And these shifts that we're seeing in the world now, when we record that China, the world's most populous economy, India, the world's second most populous economy, are 2 of the nations that have been the fastest growing in the world. And you compare that with the experiences that we as social scientists, as policymakers have, try and bring about poverty reduction in the world, bring about economic development in the world, even in small economies, and we realize how difficult it is, well, we appreciate what Kishore Mahbubani, the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School at the National University of Singapore, said. Realizing what's happening in China and East Asia and India is a little bit like realizing how the fattest kid in school has just won the Olympics marathon. The most difficult thing that you would imagine being able to bring about for a populous economy has just happened. The fattest kid in school has just won the marathon and the 110-meter hurdles. And this change, this profound change, is something that the rest of the world looks at and tries to come to terms with. This is where the fracturing of the political and economic landscape begins to take hold. Let's look around our own part of the world in light of the facts that I've just gone through and try and think about how we view this. Now, we sit in a university, we're enlightened social scientists, we read scholarly articles, we read books, and we know how to contextualize these dramatic changes that are going on. But what's interesting from the perspective of, once again, the political and economic landscape's fracturing is how people out there think about what's happening in the world. So here are some facts. The German Marshall Foundation goes out and surveys people along the transatlantic axis, along what used to be the global's political and economic center, among other places, and it asks them interesting questions like, where do you consider the most important part of the world for your national interest? It goes around and it asks Americans, and it asks Europeans, and it asks all people everywhere in the world, reporting what's interesting to us along the transatlantic axis. We find what we see is that for Americans, 3/4 of Americans, over 76% of Americans in a certain age group, say that Asia is the most important region for their national interest. This black line, this black bar, shows the fraction of the population within a certain age group that says Asia is the most important region. That whether or not they look at our picture of the shifting world economy, or whether they simply experience it intuitively at a gut level from what they see happening around them in their town or their industry, over 3/4 of Americans aged between 18 to 24 say that Asia is the most important region for their national interest. Now that ratio falls. The black line, the black bar falls so that by people who are pensioners, 65 plus, only a third consider Asia to be the most important region for their national interest. They might still be looking at a world that they once knew, looking at the transatlantic axis, looking at Western Europe. People out there, the young people, the people who are going to be running industry, running policies, appreciate and realize that the world is changing in this way, because if you had asked those people, the people who are now pensioners, a couple of decades back, they would have said not Asia, but Western Europe. But a shift in perspective is indeed occurring out there. That's the good news. The bad news is that when you ask them, is this rise of the East opportunity or threat? Now this particular graph has a little bit too much detail given the scale of this room. Let me report to you what the critical finding here is. The number of Americans who consider the rise of the East a threat is double the number of Americans who consider the rise of the East an opportunity. Yes, 3/4 of Americans in this coming generation consider the rise of Asia where their national interest lies. But where their national interest sees greater importance could be a positive thing or it could be a negative thing. The second question unpacks that. And what we find is the rather discouraging result that double the number of Americans consider the rise of the East, the shift in the global economy, a threat rather than an opportunity. We see a fracturing of the world's economic and political landscapes. This fracturing if we take this kind of analysis to the next step, is going to set up progressively dangerous tensions. What are those tensions? Well, now that we know what the world looks like in both political and economic terms, we can put flesh to this. The East has gone wrong in the eyes of many in the West. Yes, the rise of the East has shifted the world's economic center. It has transformed the nighttime sky. We're able to see how it's changed in very concrete terms. It has pulled the world's center of gravity 3/4 of the Earth's radius east already in the last 3 decades. It has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But you know what? All of that is good. But still, we are fearful. We in the West think that that might not be such a good thing. Why? Because the East has gone wrong. They put our jobs and industries at risk. The fact that they are producing, they have employed hundreds of millions of workers in cheap factories, in factories at low wages, producing output, threatens our livelihoods, threatens our industries. How will we remain competitive in the face of this massive labor force that's working at low wages, even if they continue to shift the world's economic center? And this fear is very real. That's why double the number of Americans consider the rise of the East a threat rather than an opportunity. At the same time that this fear is real, there's also a generalized fear that sits in the back of many of our minds, because we have prognosticators and observers and writers that tell us the rise of the East has unbalanced the global economy. Martin Wolf is one of the most enlightened, informed, interesting of writers on what's happening in the global economic landscape. But a few years ago, he continued to develop a line of reasoning that said that, rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly, but obviously he disagrees, that pushes the line that says the rise of the East has unbalanced the global economy. Now that is a much more abstract notion. We can understand why the rise of the East threatens our jobs and our industries. That there's this thing out there called a global economy might not be foremost in 2/3 of Americans' minds, but they are constantly told that the rise of the East has unbalanced that thing known as the global economy. That the East has gotten to be a size that's allowed them to be culpable for unbalancing the global economy, but they have not achieved the maturity to be responsible in how they manage the global economy. And this disparity has added to the dangers in the world, has added to dangers in the global financial landscape. It's described by pictures like this. This is a picture from a student at the University of Illinois who put together a graph of where the world's trade patterns, or what the world's trade patterns look like. Now, there's a little bit of more detail in this picture than one might be able to readily see on this scale. But what this picture indicates is the United States at the center of a global map. And what these arrows show is the flows of trade between different parts of the world. The most striking thing in this picture is the flow of trade from China into the United States, the flow of cheap imports into the United States. Right there is the smoking gun for why 2/3 of Americans consider the rise of the East a threat. As China continues to grow, develop its manufacturing capacity, develop its productive capacity, this flow of imports into the United States will continue to threaten US jobs, will continue to put at risk the US industrial landscape. And right there, if we are to believe writers about the global international financial architecture, right there is the dangerous unbalancing of the global economy. Okay. But we'll recognize as we develop the case for why the world feels ill at ease with this shift in the global economy, it is not just the West that worries about why the East has gone wrong. It's true that the West worries about how the East is putting at risk Western jobs, Western industry, unbalancing the global economy. But heck, when I travel in the East and I try and talk to people about what's happening in the global economy, they have a set of concerns that are in common with social scientists, economists, observers in the West, the East constantly worries about whether it is trapped in a so-called middle income trap, a terminology that the World Bank introduced some years back that suggests that as economies grow, they get trapped at a region where they remain middle income and are unable to grow further. Okay. They worry about whether their economies have been driven by simply over-investment, that they've overbuilt the landscape around them. They worry about whether growth is unbalanced, whether the rich people on the one hand are benefiting too much from the growth that's happening, whether different parts of the East, different parts of China, one is pulling away from the other while certain other parts remain underdeveloped. They worry about whether they've over-specialized in producing cheap electronics and not done enough for R&D and more general high-tech goods, whether they're overly specialized in manufacturing, whether the domestic consumption base is going to be sufficiently strong for when the West slows, as it seems to have done since 2008. The East worries about why the East has gone wrong, and these concerns are held in common with the West. And once you get started thinking about why the East has gone wrong, I'm afraid you just can't stop, because then you start worrying about how the East, China, East Asia, is underdeveloped in terms of systems of governance that we in the West feel are correct. We think that the East is corrupt, there's a lack of transparency, there's weak rule of law. Surely these things will slow down the East. The East has gone wrong, even if it seems like it's been successful for the last 3 decades. My friends, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, an economist at MIT and political scientist at Harvard, have recently written a book about why nations fail. And one of their examples is how so-called extractive elites in East Asia and elsewhere in the world, but most interestingly in East Asia, have benefited too much from the growth that has occurred over the last 30 years, and that these people, these extractive elites, will not allow systems of governance to develop in the East that will then permit them to continue to grow further. And these extractive elites are socially divisive. They contribute to the general feeling of social instability in East Asia and China. The steep inequality that we see in China is going to raise questions within that state itself, is going to challenge the political legitimacy of the current ruling governing elite. And this political legitimacy, once it's challenged, will give rise to greater social instability. And so the East itself, in its headlong rush to pull the world's center of gravity eastwards in this way, contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. The East has gone wrong. And from the perspective not just of threatening growth in the West, but threatening growth in itself. Demography is unfavorable in the East. It is an aging population. The Chinese themselves worry about this through a phrasing that they worry that China might grow old before it gets rich. And so there's general despondence out there about whether this shift in the global economy that you and I have just described at the beginning of this lecture can continue. There are all kinds of problems. The West sees problems with it, the East sees problems with it. What's gone wrong in the world? Well, there is one simple answer that economists, my colleagues among economists, put forwards. And I put this forwards really as a way for us, for David and me and for others in this area, to continue a conversation about global governance. Because when economists look at the litany of problems that I've just gone through, look at the dangerous instability in the world, they have a simple solution. They say this is a solution that goes back to Charles Kindleberger. And they describe how this works. They think, economists think, that the problem with the world, these problems with the East, problems with East-West relations, these general feelings of insecurity, these have emerged because the world has lost its way. And a significant way in which the world has lost its direction is that the world now stands at risk of losing its global hegemon, the United States, the world leader. Peter Temin and David Vines have a book coming out in Princeton University Press called The Leaderless Economy, where they rehearse this argument that the United States has lost the will, or perhaps the resources, to act as global hegemon, to act as world leader. Part of the reason the world crisis erupted, part of the reason that the world crisis has continued, is that the United States is no longer willing or able to influence and determine world outcomes. There is no longer a global hegemon out there, and this loss of global hegemony is what's undermining global stability. When you pursue this argument, it all sounds very plausible. These are, after all, colleagues of mine who are technical economists. I want to believe them. But it makes me think of a world that looks like this. It makes me think of a world where the United States thinks of itself as number one, and everything else in the world revolves around it as satellite. This is a caricature that obviously Peter Temin and David Vines, as reasonable economists, would not subscribe to. But when I read arguments about how the world has lost a global hegemon, and that's why the world is unstable, it makes me think about this cartoon. And it is not helped. My worries, and my own personal worries, about whether our social science thinking is perhaps going the wrong way, is not helped when I read other people that I respect, Brad DeLong and Barry Eichengreen among others, who talk about how they wish we could restore to the world a power and willingness for the United States to take on the responsibility of running the world, of running the IMF, running the World Bank, running the United Nations. This is what will restore balance to the world. I find this line of reasoning quite difficult to square with what I think about of how the world has changed in the last 30 years. If we had gone back to the beginning of this lecture and looked at the global economy as described by that NASA satellite photograph, I could imagine how if once again we had an alignment of the global political and economic landscapes, then this line of reasoning might make sense. But I think the world has moved on. Nonetheless, these writers, economists, are writing this year, right now, about how we need to restore global hegemony. So I want to suggest how this might not be the right thing to do. So I want to raise an economist's voice and raise economist evidence that goes against what many economists seem to think ought to be conventional wisdom. And I hope that by doing that, I can excite and enthuse my colleagues among you who are not economists, but who are interested in these issues as well, to engage with economists on this, because I think it is important to do this. Because after all, it might not be the United States who ends up bearing the burden of that sacrifice. So let me conclude my talk now, having described this tension, by giving you just a set of facts about why I think this view of the world is problematic. A recent IMF study asked the question, what would happen if the United States, the IMF did not couch its study in this way. What it asked was, what would happen to the global economy if China revalued its currency by 20%? Another way to read this might be, what would happen to the global economy if the United States, if US politicians got their way according to the populist rhetoric they've been spouting for the last decade, but forcing China to revalue its currency? From their perspective, what that would do is restore balance to the global economy. It would bring jobs and industry back to the United States. China could not keep exporting the world. That large arrow of imports heading into the US economy would shrivel away. We would no longer have this dangerous unbalancing of the global economy. If we could only convince the Chinese to allow their currency to revalue, to appreciate, The IMF went and did a study like this. They asked what would happen to gross domestic product in different parts of the world if the Chinese RMB appreciated by 20%. This is what they found. They found that if there were 20% real appreciation, China, in the very near term, would suffer a loss in its gross domestic product of between 2 to 3%. Over the medium term, its GDP would fall by almost 10%. Well, you know, maybe this is a good thing, because what that would do is bring jobs and industry back to the United States. So we cast our eye down this table, and we ask ourselves what would happen to the US economy if China did appreciate its currency in that way. Well, what the IMF found is that in the near term, the United States economy would do basically nothing. The change in US GDP would be less than observable with a microscope. Over the slightly longer term, it wouldn't be that different. The US economy would still be flat. In terms of what would happen to a rebalancing between the United States and China with an appreciation, a realignment of the exchange rate, the answer is we would see a lot of pain in the world. China would lose 10% of its income over the medium term. It would throw hundreds of millions of humanity back into extreme poverty with hardly any positive influence on the United States or on Western Europe or on the United Kingdom. And we realize that actually this change in the world is right now has changed the world's patterns of trade as well. If we look around the world and we ask what developed advanced economies continue to be successful, among the most successful of those is Germany. How has Germany continued to be successful when its major export markets, the United States, the rest of the European Union, have collapsed around it? Well, the quick answer, when we look at the IMF's direction of trade statistics, what we find is that where Germany exports today is the green line, which is developing Asia. Developing Asia now is an export market for Germany that's about 1.5 to double the size of the US export market for Germany. And it's not just a China story. It's not just Germany providing high-tech engineering to China, because Germany's exports to China are only about 2/3 of Germany's exports to the East overall. Turn to other measures of the rise of the East, other measures by which we might rethink, recalibrate our view of global hegemony of the United States being the way to run global governance. Part of the reasoning, part of the argument that you and I have just gone through about why the East has gone wrong is that perhaps governance in the East sees no political legitimacy. Well, you know, instead of sitting around and theorizing whether the East does not have ballot box democracy, and that's why it's in trouble, that's why political legitimacy is not assured, let's go out and actually ask people in the East what they think of where their government is taking them. So the Pew Foundation is a think tank in Washington, D.C. It goes around the world, it surveys social and political attitudes, and it went to China, and it asked Chinese citizens, are you satisfied with the direction that your country is taking under your current national leadership? Under your current national leadership, the Chinese Communist Party, the Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, since 2008, Chinese citizens, when surveyed, have indicated approval of the direction of their economy, never lower than 85%. 85% of the Chinese citizens surveyed think that their country is going in the right direction under the current leadership. In America, when you ask that same question, the number of citizens answering positively is never higher than 36%. Okay, we might say these numbers should not be taken at face value. Who knows what Chinese citizens are worrying about when they see some foreigner come around with a clipboard asking them questions about their national leadership? They might not tell the truth. But even if they don't tell the truth by 20%, that's still a 65% approval. And Americans might be more willing to complain. It's a free society, there's a free press, they know about what's going on here. But even if you adjust it upwards, these numbers by 20%, these are still comparable to each other. In fact, they still show a higher approval rating, greater political legitimacy in China than in the United States. I've already talked about growth and poverty. I've already talked about growth, the contribution of the East to the global economy. Finally, as I conclude, let me also indicate how the world obviously has moved on from a picture of how the East is growing because it's exporting to the West. The East continues to export a lot to the West, but in the last 10 years, the fraction of total exports from either China or the rest of East Asia to the West has fallen by between 10 to 20 percentage points. And that's not even counting the so-called iPhone problem, because 100% of the iPhones that are manufactured in China show up as part of that arrow indicating exports from China into the United States. 100% of the value of an iPhone shows up as part of the US trade deficit against China. But what we know is that of that 100% of the value that shows up as a trade surplus that China enjoys, China actually gets to keep only 2% of the value of the iPhone. Most of the rest of it is collected from parts along the way in the global supply chain. As for whether the Chinese or East Asians are facing a demographic time bomb, I'm going to conclude with this. Worries about how the East has gone wrong, worries about whether the West needs to reassert a global hegemony in governance, worries about the legitimacy of the East, turns on, among other things, whether the East can continue to preserve a political stability, whether the East can continue to grow. And right here, all observers agree that China and East Asia face a demographic time bomb. Let me take a couple of minutes to describe this and then conclude. Here is the picture of the world that many economists draw. When societies are young and populations are growing, these societies are dynamic. As Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook said, young people, they're just smarter. They're entrepreneurial, they're dynamic, they're the ones that keep economies going. As societies age, this demographic dividend from having lots of young people will go away. And as societies grow older, they will slow down. The East is growing older. China is growing older faster than almost anyone else. And it's got to slow down. And as it slows down, this dissatisfaction, this political illegitimacy of the current regimes, not just in China but elsewhere in East Asia, will become more and more manifest. Among other headline figures, China's old, the over 60, will grow from 166 million to 342 million. We will have 340 million old Chinese who are not dynamic, who are not going to be on Facebook, who are not entrepreneurial, who are going to be slowing down the rest of the economy. And this is going to be a bad thing because China is going to grow old before it gets rich. And as it does that, the cracks in the political facade will become more and more evident. Okay. This is a huge problem, but I suggest it's probably overplayed. And my ending with this is that we need to think about what's happening in China and East Asia with the rest of the world. Part of where David and I first connected was our common interest in the Gulf region and in the Middle East. And what we know about the Middle East is that actually the Middle East has a very young population. The Middle East still has a population boom. High fraction of the population is young, but that is a problem for the Middle East. Middle East will, in the next 10 years, have 100 million more young people for whom we will need to create high-paying jobs that are productive, that are satisfying to them, and there's no guarantee that we can do that. So I end by suggesting that as we think about how the world is changing, and we worry about China and East Asia losing this demographic dividend and facing 340 million more old people, which is more dangerous for political stability in regions or in the world. 340 million more old people practicing Tai Chi in the park in Beijing, or 100 million young people dissatisfied because the West, the world, the global economy, previously configured along the transatlantic axis, is no longer able to create jobs for them. How do we fix this world? Thank you very much.
I think we should take advantage now of being a more intimate group this evening we don't sure we need a roaming mic, since the people at the furthest back are not that far back, unless you ask a question at the very back. Or perverse, if you want to stay there, otherwise you could come forward and have a more slightly informal discussion. And I'd like just to, perhaps we could just take 2 or 3 questions at a time so we can just get a general discussion going. Who would like to start? Yeah. You might need a mic, actually. Here's a mic. Coming. I underestimated the problem.
I was just wondering if you'd considered what the optimal speed of adjustment of the center of gravity might be, and based on that, what the policy implications might be for Chinese exchange rates.
Should we just keep, let's just take a few questions. Come on, the political scientists and economists at the front.
Yeah, I would like, there was a commentator on the radio who mentioned that you've got a rapid industrial power increasing that lacks natural resources. You've got a complex arrangement of alliances, political and trade, and then the scenario he was describing was 1919. What do you reckon the chances of conflict breaking out in the East?
Anoush, here we are in front. We'll stop at 3, yeah?
Thank you very much, Danny, for a really amazing presentation and excellent insights. I'm interested in looking at the bit in the middle that you didn't focus on tonight, and that is the role of corporations who are driving this transfer of power from one side to the other, and indeed sometimes back in the other direction. And the question you pose at the end, how do we fix the world? If we look beyond demography and states, the third partner is corporations. Where do they map in your worldview, and what role do you think they can play in trying to put right what the states cannot?
Okay, thank you. So on the first question, which had to do with whether there's a way to think about an optimal way for the world to come to terms with these adjustments that are needed. If we try and adjust the world too quickly, our mindset, our political mindsets, our mindsets about how we benefit from different parts of the world growing in different ways, we can't as easily come to terms if the world adjusts too rapidly. Now we have to weigh that against how this shift of the global economy east has improved the lot of humanity by lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And it continues to need to do that. Close to 2 billion people in the world still live on the extreme edges, still live on less than $1 a day, $1.50 a day. Most of those people still live in the East, still live in East Asia. I know most of us in the West have a focus on what's happening in Africa, in the African continent, and it's true that poverty there is stark and concentrated. What we need is development on those fronts. And in my books, if the shift in the world's economic center means development that continues to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, that's something that we need to happen. When we appreciate the reality of that, everyone who is arguing about poverty reduction in the world, we need to focus on how the rise of the East is helping us do this. In a nutshell, I guess, in this kind of a forum, if I had to make my answer fit within the framework that we're working with here, I would have to leave it at that. But I would like to write some papers that describe technically how we operationalize this idea, how we calibrate and measure this optimal rate of adjustment, because I do think it is important. But my first order of magnitude answer is that we need to think about poverty in the world, poverty reduction in the world. The second question describes a situation that I see also in a book by a historian called The Sleepwalkers, where he described how in the run-up to the start of the First World War, all of Europe thought that we had left wars behind us. All of Europe in the run-up to the First World War thought that war was a thing of the past. The world had come to terms with each other, mostly through economic globalization, through the flow of people, resources, goods and services across national boundaries. Europe thought it had put wars behind it. And when we look at those numbers, economic globalization in the run-up to 1914 was even more intense than what we see today. There was far greater flow of people, of investment, of capital, of goods and services across national boundaries then than we have now. So a salutary lesson from that is that economic globalization, trade alone, will not prevent conflagration of the worst kind. And there are people starting to draw comparisons between what's happening in the South China Sea, the little flare-ups that we see over the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands, things going on between China and the Philippines, Chinese passports getting printed with a map of China that incorporates huge parts of Asia that continue to be in dispute. There are people who are putting an interpretation on this that suggests that China is becoming more robust and muscular in how it deals with the rest of the world, how it deals with the rest of Asia. I think these are dangers that we need to be mindful of. We need to pay attention to. I think that, however, it is easy to overplay these dangers. Things that are happening now in a part of the world that's not heavily militarized, despite what we hear about China's increasing spending on military power. Things are happening in a part of the world where the need for economic development is much more pronounced, much stronger than Western Europe saw for itself in the run-up to the First World War. And my hunch is that those needs will be paramount. People will see the need, people will see a greater space for cooperation, for economic cooperation, than for violent confrontation. I hope that that's right, but we'll see what happens. On Anush's point about what's left in the landscape for corporations and for businesses, I don't have very great insight into this, and I hope that I can invite scholars like yourself and others on the front row here to reflect on these issues and perhaps to engage with this. Corporations have, for the last 50 years now, played, I think, a very constructive role in bringing about economic development in parts of the world that previously we hadn't been able to reach. And I think it is precisely through this kind of economic development that we will see, even if it's a greater shift, even if it's a greater fracture of the world's economic political landscapes, an improvement in the lot of humanity.
Just on cue. Corporations man here.
I'm one of your friends from Australia, from the country that's dark and full of kangaroos. I want to talk about power, and as a friend, I'm asking this, playing devil's advocate to some extent. But if I ask myself the question, who controls the World Bank? Who controls the IMF? Where do the major corporations come from? And if we look at them, mostly they still come from that transatlantic corridor that you were talking about. They are really more national entities, national actors, national corporations with international interests than they're truly global. And as the new corporations emerge from the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and other places, they are largely playing by the rules that have been made by the corporations and the countries and the international organizations that came before them. And also, we see that as China joins the World Trade Organization and other such international organizations, it has to play by the rules as well. Therefore, power in the world is not just about where, sorry, I'm giving a bit of a lecture, but you asked for it, so you're getting it. If we look at power in the world, it's not just about where economic activity happens, and that's certainly shifted to the east. It's about who controls that economic activity, who makes the rules for the world, who sets the rules of the game. And just playing devil's advocate, I'd suggest that that is still in the old parts of the world where people over 65 think matter to them.
Great, excellent, thank you. Do you want to pass the mic to your right, to Ava, sitting next to you?
Thanks, Danny. It was great. Just a quick question on another part of Asia, which is India. And just thinking, current debates there focus hugely on decoupling and have done so since the economic crisis. Indian policymakers, rather, not India as a whole, seems to think that this could be a good way forward, rather than attempting to fix the world, in the sense that they do not actually see that much needs fixing at the moment, except to carry on what they're doing and protecting their interests when it comes to sort of financial and capital markets, for instance. So do you think this is a viable route to growth, and because it clashes so much with China's policies?
And now, just to complete the third question, can you just pass? There's a little monopoly. No, we're going back to Professor Ejinami here, who wants to come back on the issue of companies or
I don't actually. If there is nobody else pressing, I would like to ask another question.
We'll let you three monopolize
so
it just this time, and then we'll go back.
I'll hang on and then let
Go
that
on,
person
just,
have it first.
can I suggest, actually, Patrick, that we'll just keep this line of reasoning going, and then we'll go back.
However, the focus is going to shift completely from
Can you
what
get on
John
your
and
question,
Eva
please, Anush?
have been talking about. Danny, the other aspect that, again, we didn't talk about tonight is the role that values play in disseminating power and in shaping power relationships. And one of the issues about particularly China, and it explains the results of the data that you were projecting, is that with Americans, it's all about values. Bunch of busybodies, but we know where they stand on a whole host of global issues. They may be hypocritical, they may have multiple ways of implementing them, but nevertheless, they espouse values that, at the very least, sounds good, even to a hungry person. With China, by this golden rule of sovereignty is king, and therefore you don't interfere in internal affairs of other countries, you stand back and let Rome burn. And if that is the choice that you have, which would you rather have? The one that is misguided but intervenes, or the one that, for all sorts of sufficiency reasons, fails to intervene?
Okay, three good questions, and then we'll move backwards just after these.
Okay. Thank you. You know, as David says, three good questions, but three questions that are very extensive and lead into very deep waters. So I won't be able to do justice, but let me just quickly speak to each of them. On the question about whether the corporations that control the world, corporations that are the ones that engage in most of the economic activity that we see, whether the economic activity is located in Guangzhou in China, or Shenzhen, or in North Carolina. Now, the assertion that's being made, the challenge that's being posed here as well, these corporations remain as they were. This shift in the global economy that's been documented here is a shift that is really not particularly informative, because the underlying power structures that control economic activity, that control the world, remain as they were. Okay, there's a lot of I think there's a lot of validity to that view. I would like to be able to document that more extensively and engage a debate in what the empirical facts on that are, but that it certainly sounds very reasonable. Where does that hit the thesis that I'm trying to construct here? On the one hand, if the world really hasn't changed, then we have an open question to try and understand why the world now sees the instability and the insecurity that it now confronts, if the world really hasn't changed. My thesis is that the world has changed, and that's part of what's going on here, but my proposal is not to go down the line of global hegemony, but to try and find something else. Okay. I think beyond that, I don't really have, I think we would need to engage a lot on what the facts are more. On Eva's point about India, and India and decoupling, I think decoupling used to be thought of as the way ahead, because that's what East Asia was doing. And then decoupling became a dirty word, because it struck more and more, it struck people that actually what East Asia was doing was exporting to the West. And so the West remained tightly coupled to the East, because the West was actually the consumption engine of growth for the East. When the global financial crisis happened, I like to think that decoupling got another look in, because when the global financial crisis happened, the East continued to grow when the West stagnated. The East has contributed 40% of the world's growth since 2007 from a size that is just a tiny fraction still of the economic value, the total size of Western Europe and the United States. I think what's happening in the world is that clusters of trade, clusters of exports are emerging within the East itself. And it's a new kind of decoupling. So I like to think that decoupling is coming back in fashion. It's no longer a bad word, but it's not the kind of decoupling that we used to think it was. But your question was also about India and governance in India, what India's views were on these changes in the global system. India, I think, faces a critical point in how it's going to try and go forwards. It's when what the rest of the world thought of as the Manmohan Singh-driven reforms took hold, and India moved from the derogatory Hindu rate of growth to growth rates that might even be imagined to rival those of China. I think many observers who want India to succeed thought that something profound and fundamental had changed. Many of us did not note that Manmohan Singh continued to have many chains of links and connections to an older government hierarchy, an older government elite, which was no longer in the forefront of political power, but nonetheless, becoming clearer and clearer, continues to run a lot of the political system. So it might be that the Manmohan Singh political reforms really did not take hold, and that India is falling back to its close to zero rate of growth, to its increasing poverty in a way that China has been able to escape. Many Indian entrepreneurs have the view that when they try and create value, add wealth, do something that's profitable, that brings about employment, they end up fighting the national government rather than having the national government on their side. A perspective that's quite different from that we see from entrepreneurs in China. Does that mean that India needs to, does that mean that, where does that put India in how it views changing global governance? Not in a very optimistic position, I think. Okay. Finally, okay, give me a key word on what you want me to address. Oh, yeah, all right, yeah, of course. Misguided values, that the West, when the West goes out there and is the political champion, is the leader of the world in the global political landscape, it does so not just from the vantage point of economic power, but it does so from a perspective that says the values that it holds are universal. The rest of the world needs to be more like us. If we're going to do ballot box democracy, the rest of the world has to do that, because that is the route to success. And you correctly point out the East has no such aspirations. The East is quite happy to actually do the things that says economic, do your economic activity. Believe in markets, not because it is a principle, but because it's what gets things done. I think that that's actually a very successful pragmatic way to undertake your economic life. And it's turned out to be a very good one for East Asia.
You happy to take just a few more? I can see you flagging a bit. There were some people on this side at the back.
There was a question from here from quite a while back.
From where? Yeah. Oh, please do. And then we'll come back to you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this presentation. My question is in regard to Africa, which you briefly mentioned when explaining on poverty alleviation. I was wondering, what is your opinion on the role that Africa has in coming forwards, especially given that it's enjoying more political stability and prosperity, and has in the past few years been turning to partnerships with China, particularly in regard to construction and development in the secondary sector. So, thank you.
Africa. All right, gentleman at the very back.
Thank you, Professor, for your excellent speech. My question is, where do you think that Chinese government legitimacy comes from? From your lecture, it seems to me that legitimacy mainly derives from Chinese government success in economy. Because according to the survey conducted by the Pew, that 85% of the population are satisfied with the government's direction. But the economy in China is a two-edged sword because it also causes a lot of problems, especially the corruption in government and the unbalanced distribution of wealth and the climate pollution. And so the question is, where do you think that legitimacy come from? Is it really from economy? If it is from economy, how can the Chinese government maintain its economy and at the same time contain the problems that might undermine that legitimacy? Thank you.
Okay, let's take a few more. The gentleman with his hand in the middle.
Yeah, thank you. In talking about the future being China and the East, etc., it's really back to the future, because 250 years ago, the center of global economic activity was in the East, then it went West, and it's gone back East again. But the point I want to ask you about is the point which has just been raised at the back there. China, to me, seems to have immense problems coming up in the future. Ones which you've already mentioned, which are to do with the demography. But it's also got this economic freedom. It's gradually been increasing economic freedom. So the substructure is more freedom. And then there's a political structure on top of it, which is denying freedom. And you've got a communist government, when we assume that socialism is about equality, and now China is possibly the most unequal country on earth. Now, to me, there are tensions in China, problems with the environment, problems with overinvestment, problems with demography. It has huge problems. And do you really think that China can, in the next 10, 20 years, evolve to a more democratic, freer society, which I think the point was being made back there, in a peaceful kind of way, and move to a kind of sustainable model? To me, the current model is not sustainable.
Can you happy to pick up just one more question here? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. A really blunt question. Talking about hegemony, do you see China at some stage taking over this role of sort of playing Atlas, bearing the weight of the world on its shoulders, like being more assertive in a way?
I'll add something after that. I was going to raise the question, but let me come back to you at the very end.
Okay, thank you. A wide range of issues raised in this last round of questions. On Africa, Africa, I think at this point is what humanity, all of humanity hopes will be the next wave of success. It is the part of the world that we have continued to not been able to bring along in terms of prosperity, poverty reduction, improvement in the quality of life. I am optimistic, however, for Africa in the near future. Now, perhaps these are dangerous words because perhaps people have been optimistic for Africa for the last 50 years and it's not been able to deliver. Why do I think things are different now? Africa is perhaps the world's strongest, richest deposit of natural resources. Okay? What the world needs now in terms of continued economic development in the part of the world that's fastest growing, that's doing the best, that's doing the most for driving the global economy, is an East Asian model of development that's highly intensive in its use of natural resources. These two go hand in hand. China and many, many Asian countries see this already, and they are in direct collaboration with many African states on developing the natural resources and bringing it out to improve the lot of both societies through trade. Is this a good thing for Africa? What studies have shown most recently is that, among other things that studies have shown recently, is that in those countries in Africa where China or other Asian economies have most concentrated their attention and investment and activity, those same countries see the most dramatic improvement in governance and corruption statistics. Put another way, those countries that are engaging with the global economy now through purely economic channels, not through aid channels, not through explicit governance channels, but through channels simply of economic investment, trade, employment, it is in those countries where governance is improving most dramatically. I think that it's quite hopeful that together with the appreciation, the upward valuation of the natural resources that sit in these African states, at the same time that their governance is improving, that we will begin to see the African continent finally moving up the income scale. So I'm quite hopeful. Now, the situation is obviously a lot more nuanced than just that one fact, but I throw that out as a fact that suggests why things might now actually be different. Okay. On the next two questions that surround similar issues, the political legitimacy of the Chinese state, the sustainability of its growth path. Where does the current Chinese state derive its political hold over the rest of over its citizens? Or as someone just put it a few minutes ago, China is going to face huge problems, huge economic problems in the coming years. Will this bring down the Chinese state? Okay. So let's approach this in layers. What are the problems with the Chinese economy? Inequality, overinvestment, possible social instability, the aging population. Take these in turn. Is China an overinvested economy? Yes, in the sense that its investment GDP ratio is in excess of 50%. No other society in the world has been able to sustain that for long periods of time. That's a problem. Is Chinese growth simply being driven by the drug that says governments go out there and build bridges, build buildings, build factories that no one actually wants to build? Is it over-invested? Is it over-capitalized? From that statistic, that suggests yes. That also suggests that Chinese growth will dramatically slow when the Chinese government is no longer able to continue to do this. On the other hand, look at a different set of statistics. If we look at the reason that we worry about overinvestment is that we think the average worker in an economy will suddenly be confronted by too many machines to work on productively. There'll be too much capital around them for that worker to be able to make full use of them. Well, consider this. China continues to have 200 million people living on less than $1 a day. Half of the geography of China is massively undercapitalized. Even when you look at the aggregate, the average capital stock per person in China is only 1/7 that of the United States. China is still an undercapitalized economy. Is investment too high? I suspect not. Contrary to what many, many observers say, China is not, has not reached the point that, say, Japan did in the 1980s, where there's too much capital per worker. Inequality, someone pointed out, inequality in China is highest in the world. Indeed, the Gini coefficient is in excess of 50% now. The only countries in the world that have a higher Gini coefficient, well, there are three. There's the United States, there's Russia, and there's Singapore. China sits right there among the world's most unequal societies. But break that down. Where is most of the inequality in China? When social scientists go to China and survey inequality in different parts of the geography of China, here's the surprising thing they find. Whether you go to cities, or whether you go to the rural areas of China, or whether you go to provinces in China, the inequality that happens within each of these local geographies is about the same as the inequality that you see everywhere else in the world. It is not the same stratospheric scale that you see in the United States or Singapore or Russia. Where is China's inequality? China's inequality comes from the fact that the East Coast is rich, overbuilt, has lots of the factories, has most of the manufacturing, and the Western hinterland still has 200 million people living in poverty. Almost all of the inequality in China comes from that regional divide. Inequality, that kind of inequality can be repaired. It's easily repaired. How? By the Chinese government investing more in the western part of China, by allowing the western part of China to be brought into the national economy that is China and the global economy. How will it do that? It does that by building bridges, by building railways, by building high-speed trains, so that goods and services manufactured in the western part of China can be brought to Shanghai to be shipped to the United States. In one fell swoop, what China needs is more investment that will repair inequality, and it will minimize the social divide. It will minimize the danger for social instability. There is a great role for the Chinese government to continue to do this. And indeed, this is something that shows up constantly. It used to show up constantly in who and when's political speeches. I hope that it will continue to show up in the current leadership. Is China imminently facing an outbreak of social instability? Not if it fixes these problems of inequality. I agree with you that there's a problem of the environment, but again, here the best fix for that is not to stop development in China, but to allow the western part of China to develop, to move away from the East Coast manufacturing that's already that's too expensive, overcrowded, and overpolluted. As for the demography problem, I submit again that that is overplayed. It's overplayed for the same reason that that you yourselves worry about political instability in China. The primary ingredient for political instability is angry young people. You don't get angry young people when you've got lots of old people. And then the question, the blunt question. China and hegemony. The quick answer is no. For the same reason that China does not see a universal set of values that it wishes to propagate to the rest of the world. What it wants to do, it wants to get copper from Africa. It wants to get copper from Africa in the same way that the rest of us want to get agricultural products from New Zealand. It is part of international trade. It is not trying to propagate or disseminate one view of the world onto the rest of the world.
Yes, someone else with a pressing question. Janusz? We need one more mic there. We'll just take 2 or 3 more now. We'll take you first. Go. We should come to an end in about a few minutes.
Thank you. My question is about the backup currency for the world, which for 100 years has been the United States dollars. Now, when China becomes the dominating economy in the world, then their currency will become the backup currency of the world. So what will be the consequences for the United States, obviously, because they will no longer be able to draw the benefits from greenbacks being the backup currency, but also for the whole world. I mean, positive, negative, or known, I don't know.
Okay, is there a second question? Yeah, over here. Let's keep the questions short now because
thank you for your presentation. I want to share that I share the same optimism as you do with respect to China's future and its peaceful development. Now, going back to this slide where you plotted the dots in time that slightly show that how the center of the world shifts eastward. At first glance, it seems like it's a recreation of the Silk Road that used to be in the medieval ages, like more or less. My question is, what part can Eastern Europe play in that? Which are the benefits that Eastern Europe can reap from the move eastwards? Thank you.
Okay, we'll just take one more question here, which is from Galida, and then I'll ask a question myself.
Thank you. My question is twofold. I'll try to keep them very short. You spoke about, well, the rise of the East, obviously, is the leitmotif in your discussion. I was wondering if you could comment if you think that the West and traditional established Western democracies are in relative or absolute decline, and what Western democracies can do to revitalize their societies. A second sub-question, if you'll indulge me, David, relates to your answer to the question about whether China, in assuming power, would what you explained about how China doesn't seek to propagate its values. I wonder if you think that that would change as China or any other society assumes increased proportions of power within the world. I think you understand the line of reasoning. I won't push the point further.
Sure, thank you. I'd just like to make just a comment and then ask you just a question. The comment is about democracy, legitimacy, effectiveness, and authoritarianism, and the question is about military power and where that fits into the story. The comment about democracy is essentially this, and I say this as someone who's written about democracy for 25 years or more. In social sciences, and particularly in political science, over the last 2 decades, there's generally been a consensus that democracies are more effective, they react more quickly to information, the balance between democracies and market societies is almost an ideal combination of a response mechanism whereby politicians and markets between them follow signals, prices and votes, which gives them a capacity to move rapidly and to into some kind of positive, virtuous circle between democracy, effectiveness, responsiveness, and so on. And the claim in political science was what you see in authoritarian countries is the reverse of all of that. That authoritarian countries are not sensitive to information, they do not know what's going on, they try to seek imposition through coercion and power, they cannot be effective almost by definition, and they cannot win legitimacy. The 2007-8 financial crisis led to the interesting initial responses. UK, in order to boost its economy during the crash, invested about 5 to 6% of new money into the economy in green technology. Germany 12%, South Korea 36%, China 35%. What this tells us, and underneath this story, is something much more fundamental, that it's China, by and large, that is, apart from Germany and Europe, that has led the way in the shift to green technologies. The responsiveness of China to the concerns of economic and to climate change have led to a very rapid responses. So what you begin to see, and may begin to see, is Washington characterized by gridlock, a lack of capacity for decision-making on crucial issues, democracies corrupted by powerful lobbies, financial interests, and so on, Europe increasingly preoccupied by the stability of the euro, the instability of the euro, and other economies that are able to mobilize resources quickly because they're not caught up in these endless interest constellations, may have a greater leverage on effectiveness. And effectiveness seems to still count for legitimacy in the figures that you showed us earlier. So that's just a thought I'd like you to respond to. I think the consensus in political science on where the virtuous and corrupt circles are is now in question in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. The question I wanted to ask you is about warfare in all of this. because one of the threads that you didn't have time to discuss is really what this shift looks like in terms of military power, investment, and so on. My understanding is the US is still investing, until, let's say, the effects of the current budgetary changes go through the system, is investing 90% more in military power than that of China. And whilst China is rearming, it is doing so relatively modestly, and it's still looking at as military investment as a way of shoring up its economic interests overseas, rather than in terms of expansion and so on. So the US, and to a less extent Europe, are still investing, despite the vulnerability of their economies, and here's the issue, are still investing heavily in military structures, the yield of which in productivity and economic gain is going to be not minimal, but not impressive. Add to that, since 9/11, the pursuit of a series of very expensive wars in the West, from Afghanistan, Iraq, to less extent in North Africa and Libya, which have fed into the crisis of fiscal problems. And I think that's another part of the story too. So whilst you're getting the shift of power, economic power to the east, you're still getting, as it were, West behaving militarily as if nothing had changed. But in each and every case, they discover that the geopolitical results of each and every one of these wars is counterproductive. Not just only counterproductive in geopolitical terms, but counterproductive in geoeconomic terms. The war in Iraq alone costing over $3 billion. And I wonder whether the story of the economic shift to the east, along with this constant story of the West's reinvestment in a military power and the attempt to constantly shore up its position against those changes, doesn't tell us something rather dramatic.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so a rich set of things, a rich set of new ideas that have been introduced. So let me try and speak to the ones that I can, ones that I can. There was the first question about the world's reserve currency. You know, the United States has, for the last century now, been the country that issued the world's reserve currency. And as the French used to say, it has gained an exorbitant privilege economically from being the country that did that, the country that issued that. It faced deep and ready markets for borrowing from. It allowed its consumers to shift risk away from them to the rest of the world. It allowed for cheap credit to always be available for the US economy. It allowed for the rest of the world to view the US economy as a country that would never default because it was the world's reserve currency. And then the question that was asked is, as China continues to rise in the world, will we see a shift away from the US dollar? Now, the history on these shifts is actually quite instructive. There was a time when it wasn't the US dollar that was the world's reserve currency. Instead, it was the pound sterling. And the pound sterling continued to be the world's reserve currency for almost 70 years after the United States had overtaken Great Britain as the world's economic leader. A couple of lessons from that. One is that there's great persistence in how the world uses money. It could well be that the United States will, in 100 years, be the world's third or fourth economic power. It'll be behind China and India and Brazil. But we will still be using the US greenback as the world's reserve currency. And certainly, the statistics that we have available today suggest that nothing that has happened in the last 10 years, nothing that's happened since the global financial crisis has shifted the world's appetite away from the US dollar. Okay. Yes, the world can be 42% propelled by China. China can have grown 3 times more, added to the world 3 times more than the United States did. But hey, we're still going to stick with the US dollar. The latest statistics confirm that that persistence seems to be the story. Now, if we do shift, then the hope is that that shift will be as seamless as the last time this happened. Pound sterling simply handed over leadership to the US dollar, and then the rest of the world just went about its way. We'll see, but I don't think anyone expects that to happen. for a long time still, even if China overtakes the United States within the next 10, 15 years, which more and more people are coming around to believe. There was a question about the role of Eastern Europe. Actually, if I may take the Eastern Europe question together with the question about whether the West is in decline, because there's a similar thread that runs through this. The calculations that I showed here might be a good way to address the question of whether the West is in relative decline. Even when the world center of gravity has shifted from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to the boundary between India and China, if all of that does come to pass as smoothly as that picture suggests, the United States economy will be 3 times larger then in 2050 than it currently is. In absolute decline, not by any stretch of the imagination. The average American will be double as well off then as she is today. So not in question. What matters here, however, is that in the mindset of in the political mindset of many Americans, not Westerners, but many Americans, what matters is not the absolute position that they occupy, but the relative. Are they going to be number one? And by definition, once you pose the question in that way, the world becomes zero-sum. No matter how well off you yourself are, if you're not number one, you've lost. That's a dangerous mindset. What can the West and Eastern Europe contribute to this? Well, the West and Eastern Europe, we've developed expertise in providing social systems of welfare, in providing socialized medical care, in providing socialized health care that the East is in desperate need of. The East needs to know how to take care of these 340 million old people who are not going to be on Facebook, so they have nothing to do, who are not going to be entrepreneurial, so we need something to take care of them. But they will be cash rich, and they will be looking at a landscape where the social system does not know how to take care of them. We in the West know how to do that. What we should be doing is figuring out ways to leverage that economic advantage. Where does Eastern Europe fit in that landscape? Eastern Europe has a history of developing socialized systems of provision of public goods that it needs to communicate better to the rest of the world. The West does that more generally. Will China become a hegemon? I think we've kind of already dealt with that. I don't think it will. But I want to pick up these comments that David has introduced into the discussion, the democracy question. It's extremely interesting that your intervention came in that form, because I think that the rise of the East, what's happened in Singapore for the last 4 decades now, have constantly posed challenges to a Western style of thinking of the advantages, inherent advantages of democracy. And we forget that democracy is an invention that really only took hold after the Westphalian system of states blossomed. Democracy was developed as a political and philosophical system when humanity remained sharply divided into slaves and free people, and men and women. So there's nothing inherently attractive about democracy. It has worked extremely well for a long time. The rapidity with which systems with greater state control was able to respond to emergencies, not just emergencies like in the global financial crisis, but in national health emergencies. The United States itself subscribed to that view when it threatened to rip off intellectual property rights protection off of anthrax medication once it suspected that terrorism could introduce anthrax into the US postal system. The United States itself is quite free with practicing non-democratic ways of governance if it realizes the emergency that it faces. And here's the thing, most of the developing world faces these emergencies every single day. They look around and they see hundreds of millions of people on the brink of starvation. That is an emergency. And the emerging world is constantly having to deal with that. And the hope is that we will not look at this and on a priori grounds dismiss it as being something that's unsubstantial or inherently susceptible to self-destruction. Because for the last 50 years now, it has shown that it's quite capable of regenerating itself in new forms. The military point, this military point, I think, in my interpretation, reinforces a message that I tried to introduce at the beginning, which is that the fracture in the global landscape between political, economic, and I would put military into that locus now, makes for a dangerous world. And it's a dangerous world that's not going to be repaired by a restoration of global hegemony. In fact, it might even be worsened.
Well, I think we could go on for a long time, and I've been really appreciative of the incredible questions, actually, a superb range of questions. But I have to tell the audience one thing, that Danny is so hardworking. He is catching the 4:59 back to London, 4:59 a.m. train back to London tomorrow morning. So whilst you contemplate that, you will know why I have to draw an end to the conversation now. So I want to thank the audience for a really lively set of questions, but above all, of course, thank Danny for coming here, even if you're catching a very, very early morning train. We appreciated you here for the limited amount of time we had you, Danny, and thank you very much for a tour de force. Thank you.